As we attempt to live our lives with meaning and purpose, many of us can struggle with the tendency towards perfectionism. This is perfectly understandable. Who doesn't want to both do their best and avoid making mistakes? But as anyone who has ever spent time trying to do everything perfectly will tell you, this approach is ultimately self-defeating, to say nothing of exhausting. I like to believe that this is one of the world's biggest lessons from our time in lockdown. Over the last year, many have learned to move from attempting perfection to pursuing excellence, and also learning when it is appropriate to seek out what is good or good enough. As we begin to imagine our lives moving back to a place of normalcy, how do we guard against this temptation to once again continue seeking perfection, while also not being too quick to let ourselves off the hook? This week's Parsha is named Hukat, stemming from the Hebrew word chok, or decree. And when establishing Jewish law, the rabbis of the Talmud created two major categories of commandments. The Mishpatim, the commandments whose purpose was self-evident or understandable by human beings. And then there were the Chukim, the statutes whose purpose seems to be a mystery, or at the very least not easily understood. And the classic example of a chok is that of the red heifer, introduced in the first section of our Parsha. And in a way, it relates to the idea of perfectionism as well. In this bizarre, arcane ritual, the Torah says that after finding a red heifer, which is its own challenge in and of itself, the priests are to slaughter it and burn the carcass. The ashes are then to be stored so they can be used to make a decontamination potion, the Mei Nidah, or waters of separation, which is used to purify. Can you hear me now? Okay, I hope so. Which is used to purify Israelites after contact with the dead. Besides the fact that using dead animals, ashes, and water to purify yourself from death seems confusing enough, there's also the odd detail that in the process of slaughtering the heifer, the priests themselves become impure. It is the ultimate paradox of biblical ritual practice. So how is this possible? How can the red heifer's ashes mixed with water totally purify the person with the most significant impurity of all, the contact with the dead, and yet contaminate those who prepare this recipe, and they themselves become impure? Even the wisest of all people, King Solomon, could not resolve this riddle. As it is written in Kohelet, "All this I have tried by wisdom. I said, I will get wisdom, but it was far from me." Our sages attribute King Solomon's search for wisdom to that of the riddle of the red heifer. And to add to the complexity, after the temple was destroyed, there was no way to complete this ritual. And so for thousands of years, people have been presumed to be in differing states of impurity unless they have just immersed in a mikvah. This is further complicated by the fact that the Torah requires the priests to use an animal that is incredibly, incredibly rare. Maimonides mentions in the Mishneh Torah that only 9 red heifers having existed in history up to that point. So what do we make of this? Some might say, so what? We are impure. We cannot do anything about this. So let's focus on other ways of living out Torah. And others, both Jews and Christians alike, are currently hard at work trying to breed purely red cows that can be used to reestablish this ritual purity, which in turn, the thinking goes, will either help speed up the arrival of Mashiach or facilitate the building of a third temple. Now, while in a sense I appreciate their dedication, I have to wonder whether these folks may be missing part of the point, that overlooking the paradox or creating deliberately impossible conditions to attain perfection in favor of genetic engineering or modern animal husbandry. Perhaps one reason the Torah makes it so hard to achieve perfection, to achieve this purity, is that the concept should not be seen as an item to acquire and then check off of a list, but rather as something that we work towards. That concept really resonates with modern Jewish life. There are certainly moments when our goal should be measured and achievable. And there is great merit in setting some goals, some values so lofty that they are only meant to be sought after, but never fully achieved. Now, another theme in this parsha that carries its own share of mystery is that of death. Right after we learn about the red heifer ritual, the prophetess Miriam dies. And unfortunately, we do not receive much information about her death, but we are told about a problem that it causes. The miraculous well of water that followed her through the desert has disappeared, and the Israelites are suffering from extreme thirst. This is, in fact, what leads to the most famous scene of Moses striking a rock, being told that he and Aaron will not be allowed to enter the land. And soon afterwards, Aaron dies as well. And interestingly enough, the rabbis of the Talmud add that the pillar of cloud, which was following the Israelites, disappeared at Aaron's death, echoing the loss of Miriam's well. And while we hear in much detail the circumstances surrounding the death of Aaron, there is not much comfort found in the attempt to rationalize Moses and Aaron's deaths by connecting them to the sin of striking the rock. We just learned about this from our bar mitzvah this morning. Some argue that perhaps Moses needed more faith, or that he was too angry. And perhaps they add as well that Aaron should have stopped him. That was why he has been punished as well. And perhaps the argument goes, both of them actually show true deference to God by accepting their fates relatively calmly and without great protest. The famous Professor Leibowitz of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem makes the observation that while Moses does eventually protest against his punishment in a later parsha, he only asks for the decree to be annulled, not that he be forgiven of his sin. And so Professor Leibowitz concludes that Moses does not seem to recognize that he sinned in the first place, only that he was punished. So some might see this point as evidence of Moses's hubris. Even after being told that he was unfaithful and lacked trust in God, he still doesn't seem to get it. And if Moses, the great, wise leader of the Jewish people, cannot notice when he himself has made mistakes, how much more do we simple Israelites need to guard ourselves against such blindnesses? In a sense, all of Parshat Hukat is a chok, not necessarily filled with logical reasoning that leads to great understanding. From this protective magic of the red heifer to an odd narrative nestled in the middle of our parsha that includes the creation of a copper serpent, which is to be affixed to a high pole in the camp of the Israelites, to the deaths and punishments of one of the Jewish peoples we can consider royal families. We have no easy solutions. We have no fully satisfying explanations. What we do notice, though, are the paradoxes. That purity is not without a cost of time, of effort, of resources, all to address a problem that many of us struggle to fit into the modern framework of our lives. Many may also wrestle over how to reconcile our modern perspectives with the Torah's approach to death and punishment and leadership. We are supposed to admire and respect our Jewish heroes, but not too much. Many are familiar with the Torah's refrain that there was no prophet in Israel like Moses. And I would suggest that not only should this be read as praise of Moses, but also a warning for us not to become too absorbed with trying to emulate him. Remember, Moses' bones, unlike Joseph's, were not brought along with the people into the land. His grave, unlike his siblings, was not even marked. The Torah recognizes that while we should honor our dead, we should not create personality cults around them. That we should follow in their footsteps, but if we focus too hard or solely on following in their footsteps, we never may find our own path. We are presented with the paradox that we are to consider God to be merciful and just, even as we see Miriam and Aaron killed and Moses punished for what seems like a trivial offense. Yet this does not stop us from searching for answers. Though we may not be able to find definitive explanations, just as we may not be able to achieve perfection in our lives, we can at least hope to find meaning. As the great Hasidic master Zusha of Anapol said when he was dying, he was not worried that God would ask him why he was not more like Moses, but why he was not more like Zusha. This is our task: to use the gifts and strengths we have been given and to shape our lives according to our values and community. The goal is not to become Moses or Aaron or Miriam, but to become our best selves. The goal is not perfection, but the pursuit of growth. We find in the Talmud, Rabbi Tarfon said, "It is not your responsibility to finish the work, but you are not free to desist from it either." And we find in the Talmud, Rabbi Abuhu said in the name of Rabbi Elazar, "If you try to grab too much, you may grab nothing. But if you try to grab a little, you may keep it." If instead of grasping for perfection or trying to live up to unachievable expectations, we work towards steady improvement and think about how best to leave behind blessings for ourselves and for others, then we too may find a life of meaning and a life of purpose. Ken Yehi Ratzon.